For 70 years, the world thought it knew him. The man behind the queen, the consort, the one who occasionally said the wrong thing at a garden party and made the papers the next morning. Dutiful, slightly stern, a fixture of the British royal family so permanent he seemed to have always been there, like the palace itself. But here is the thing about Prince Philip. The man the world saw, the decorated uniform, the ceremonial role, the careful 2 steps behind, was the ending of a story, not the beginning. And the beginning was something else entirely. He was born on a dining room table on a Greek island and carried off in a fruit box 18 months later. His mother spent years locked in a Swiss asylum. His father abandoned him for a mistress on the French Riviera. His sisters married into Nazi Germany. He stood at a funeral in Darmstadt at 16 years old, surrounded by officers of the Third Reich. And somewhere in a photograph from that day, you can see the boy he was, out of place, lost, and entirely alone. He had no country, no money, no home, no family to speak of. He spoke Greek so rarely that he could barely understand it. He was a prince of nowhere, belonging to no one, living out of borrowed rooms and other people's charity. And from that beginning, he built himself into a naval war hero, a man who genuinely saved lives in the darkness of the Mediterranean, and eventually, the husband of the most famous woman in the world. This is the story of how he did it. This is Prince Philip, the man nobody knew. Philip was born on the 10th of June 1921 in a villa called Mon Repos on the island of Corfu. The 5th child and only son of Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark and his wife, Princess Alice of Battenberg, he was born into a world of royal titles and European connections that stretched across half the continent. On paper, his birth seemed to mark the beginning of a privileged life. The reality was rather different. Greece in 1921 was a country in crisis. A disastrous military campaign in Turkey had gone catastrophically wrong, and when it collapsed the following year, the political consequences were immediate and brutal. Philip's uncle, King Constantine I, was forced to abdicate. His father, Prince Andrew, a professional soldier who had served in the campaign, was arrested by the new revolutionary government. For a period, Andrew's life was genuinely believed to be in danger. Several other officers from the same campaign were tried and executed. It was a British naval intervention that saved him. A warship, HMS Calypso, was dispatched to evacuate the family. Philip, 18 months old, was carried aboard in a makeshift crib fashioned from a fruit box. The family fled Greece with almost nothing, and they would not return for years. They settled in a borrowed house in the Paris suburb of Saint-Cloud, provided by a wealthy relative. It was comfortable enough, but it was not theirs. And the instability that had already begun to define Philip's life showed no signs of easing. His father, Prince Andrew, was a man who had been stripped of his military purpose and had nothing left to occupy him. He drifted socially, emotionally, and eventually geographically. The marriage that might once have held the family together began to quietly disintegrate. And then, over a few years in the early 1930s, everything collapsed at once. Philip's 4 sisters, Margarita, Theodora, Cecilia, and Sophie, all married within roughly a year between 1930 and 1931, and each married a German prince and moved to Germany. Within months, Philip had lost all 4 of the sisters who had been his closest family. The house at Saint-Cloud, already strained, suddenly felt very empty. Then came the blow that changed everything. His mother, Princess Alice, suffered a catastrophic breakdown. She had been struggling for some time. The years of exile, the separation from her children, the collapse of her marriage, the accumulated weight of a life that had never been quite stable. And in 1930, she was admitted to a sanatorium in Switzerland. She would be in and out of institutional care for years. Alice was a remarkable woman, in ways the world would only come to understand much later. Born profoundly deaf, she had learned to lip read in 4 languages, had married into Greek royalty, had survived exile and revolution, and possessed a depth of faith and courage that would eventually define her most extraordinary act. But in 1930, none of that was visible to the 10-year-old boy, who simply understood that his mother was gone and he could not reach her. He would not hear from her for 5 years. His father, for his part, settled in Monte Carlo with a mistress and largely ceased to function as a parent. A family friend who knew Philip during this period later said of Andrew, "When the boy needed a father, there just wasn't anybody there." So Philip was parceled out. He went to live with various members of the British side of his family, first with his maternal grandmother at Kensington Palace, then with his uncle George Mountbatten at Linden Manor in Berkshire. He was sent to Cheam Preparatory School. He learned to speak English with the ease and naturalness of someone for whom it was simply the language of daily life. He left France behind. He left Greece behind. He was becoming, quietly and by necessity, British, not by birth or choice, but by circumstance, because there was nowhere else for him to be. When asked in later life how he had felt about all of this, the dissolution of his family, the years of uncertainty, the childhood spent in other people's houses, his answer was the answer of a man who had learned very early that the only way through was straight ahead. "It's simply what happened," he said. "The family broke up. My mother was ill, my sisters were married, and my father was in the south of France. I just had to get on with it." You do. One does. He was 10 years old when it started. He just got on with it. In 1933, Philip's sister, Theodora, made a decision that, in retrospect, looks extraordinary in its timing. She brought Philip to Germany to attend Schule Schloss Salem, an arrangement that had the practical advantage of saving on school fees, since it was owned by her husband's family. The year was 1933. Adolf Hitler had just become the Chancellor of Germany. Philip spent 2 terms at Salem. The school itself was in the process of losing its founder, Kurt Hahn, a Jewish educator of great distinction who had established Salem on progressive humanist principles and was already being persecuted by the new regime and would flee to Scotland, where he founded Gordonston. Philip followed him there, transferring to Gordonston in 1934, and the Scottish school became the making of him in important ways. But those 2 terms in Germany were the beginning of a complicated family entanglement with the Third Reich that would shadow Philip for the rest of his life. His sisters had not merely settled in Germany. 3 of them had married men who were members of or closely associated with the Nazi Party. When Philip was 16, in 1937, tragedy arrived in the most devastating form. His sister, Cecilia, said to be the sister he was closest to, was killed in an air crash near Ostend in Belgium. Her husband, their 2 young sons, her mother-in-law, and a newborn infant thought to have been delivered prematurely during the flight, all died in the same crash. Cecilia and her husband were both members of the Nazi Party. Philip travelled to Germany for the funeral. In Darmstadt, surrounded by the full apparatus of the Third Reich, he stood among the mourners. A photograph exists from that day. Philip is 16, pale, in a dark coat, standing in a row that includes uniformed Nazi officers. That photograph has followed him ever since, and it deserves to be looked at honestly. Philip was a grieving 16-year-old, burying the sister he loved most in a country he had not chosen, surrounded by people performing a gesture that was, in that moment and in that place, the expected mark of respect at a public ceremony. There is no evidence that Philip held Nazi sympathies, none at all. The trajectory of his life argues powerfully against it, but the photograph exists, and the family entanglement was real, and it is part of the story. What is also part of the story, and this matters enormously, is what his mother did during those same years. While her daughters aligned themselves with Nazi Germany, Princess Alice, recovered now from her breakdown and living in Athens, made a choice of an entirely different kind. When the Nazi occupation of Greece began, Alice sheltered a Jewish family, the widow of a prominent Jewish politician and her children, in her home in Athens, hiding them and protecting them at considerable personal risk for the duration of the occupation. When the Gestapo came to question her, she evaded them by pretending not to understand, citing the deafness she had been born with and had lived with all her life. She had nothing to eat in the final weeks before liberation except bread and butter. She insisted on walking the streets during the fighting to hand out food. In 1993, Yad Vashem, Israel's National Holocaust Memorial, recognized her as righteous among the nations, one of the highest honors the memorial bestows. Philip planted a tree there in her honor. He said of her, "I suspect it never occurred to her that her action was in any way special. She was a person of deep religious faith, and she would have considered it a perfectly natural human reaction to fellow beings in distress." The same family, two entirely different choices, and Philip, caught between them, had made his own. Gordonston gave Philip something he had never quite had before: structure, challenge, and a context in which his natural qualities could emerge and be recognized. The school, founded by Kurt Hahn on principles of physical endurance, self-reliance, and service, suited him precisely. He was not a naturally bookish boy in the academic sense, but he was intelligent, quick, physically courageous, and possessed of a restless energy that needed somewhere to go. Gordonston gave it somewhere to go. He excelled. He captained teams, he led, he pushed himself. Teachers noticed something in him that went beyond mere competence, a quality of decisiveness, a willingness to act under pressure, a refusal to be overwhelmed by difficulty that was, when you knew his background, entirely understandable. He had been navigating crises since he was 18 months old. A Scottish boarding school in winter was not going to break him. In 1939, he left Gordonston and entered the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth. It was the obvious path. The British side of his family had deep naval roots, and his uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten, who had increasingly assumed a parental role after the death of Philip's previous guardian, was himself a naval officer of distinction. But Philip also simply wanted it. He was drawn to the sea, to the discipline, to the clarity of purpose that naval service offered a young man who had spent his entire life without a country to belong to. He graduated from Dartmouth as the best cadet in his course. Not one of the best, the best. The boy who had grown up in borrowed rooms with no father and a mother in an asylum, moving between other people's households, belonging nowhere, graduated at the top of his class. He was appointed midshipman in January 1940. Britain was already at war. Philip went to war in earnest in 1940, posted first to HMS Ramillies in the Indian Ocean, escorting convoys of the Australian Expeditionary Force. He was 18. Within a year, he had been transferred to the Mediterranean, to HMS Valiant, and it was there, in the early hours of the 28th of March 1941, that he did something that people who were present never forgot. The Battle of Cape Matapan was a night engagement off the Greek coast. The Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet, commanded by Admiral Andrew Cunningham, had intercepted the Italian fleet, and in the darkness, what followed was one of the most decisive naval actions of the war. 3 Italian heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers were sunk. Over 2,000 Italian sailors were killed. Philip's action station was the bridge of HMS Valiant, where he was responsible for operating the ship's searchlight. In a night battle, the searchlight was everything. It was the difference between finding the enemy and firing blind. Philip operated it with a precision and a coolness that his commanding officer would later put on record. He illuminated the first enemy cruiser so accurately in the seconds before HMS Valiant's guns opened fire that the ship disappeared in an explosion of smoke and flame almost instantly. He was then ordered to train left and lit up a second Italian cruiser, which received the same treatment. In the foreword of a book written decades later, Philip described the moment with characteristic understatement. "All hell broke loose," he wrote, as all our 15-inch guns started firing at the stationary cruiser, which disappeared in an explosion and a cloud of smoke. His shipmates were rather less understated about it. "Prince Philip saved our lives that night," one of them said years later. "He was always very courageous and resourceful and thought very quickly. You would say to yourself, 'What the hell are we going to do now?' And Philip would come up with something." He was 19 years old. He was awarded the Greek Cross of Valor and mentioned in dispatches for bravery and enterprise. His admiral noted that his accurate operation of the searchlight had greatly contributed to the devastating results achieved by the guns. It did not stop there. In 1942, at the age of 21, he became First Lieutenant of HMS Wallace, second in command, one of the youngest officers of that rank in the Royal Navy. During the Allied invasion of Sicily in 1943, he was on the bridge of Wallace when the ship came under sustained air attack. Facing near certain destruction, he improvised a smoke float, launched it as a decoy, then used the smoke's cover to escape. The ship survived. His commanding officers praised his practical seamanship, high intellect, good judgment, and great charm. And in September 1945, aboard HMS Whelp in Tokyo Bay, he watched the formal Japanese surrender, the last act of the Second World War. He had served from the very beginning to the very end. He had fought while 2 of his brothers-in-law fought for the other side. He had earned every decoration he wore. In the summer of 1939, before the war began, King George VI had visited the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth with his family. Philip, 18 years old and a cadet at the college, was asked by his uncle, Lord Mountbatten, to look after the King's 2 daughters, 13-year-old Princess Elizabeth and 9-year-old Princess Margaret, while their parents were occupied with official duties. They had met briefly before at family occasions, but this was different. Philip was tall, blonde, confident, already possessed of the physical ease and quick humor that would define him. Elizabeth, by all accounts, was immediately captivated. She watched him vault a tennis net. She could not stop looking at him. A family friend who was present later said she never took her eyes off him the entire day. They began to write letters. Through the years of war, through the separations and the danger and the uncertainty, the letters went back and forth. Philip, fighting in the Mediterranean and then the Pacific, wrote to a princess in England. Elizabeth, watching the war from behind palace walls, wrote back. They were third cousins through Queen Victoria, linked by blood and by the particular small world of European royalty. But what grew between them in those letters was something more personal than dynasty. When the war ended and Philip came home, the question of their future had to be faced, and it was not straightforward. Philip had no money, no country he properly belonged to, and sisters who had married Nazis and were still considered deeply inappropriate associations for the British royal family. The establishment was cautious. The press was skeptical. George VI himself was protective of his daughter in the way fathers tend to be, and the young man presenting himself was, by any conventional measure, an unlikely candidate for the hand of the heir to the British throne. Philip renounced his Greek and Danish royal titles. He became a naturalized British subject. He took the surname Mountbatten from his mother's family. He was, in the most literal sense, remaking himself, shedding the remnants of the scattered, stateless royal identity he had been born with, and becoming something new. Something British. Something that could stand beside Elizabeth without apology. Their engagement was announced in July 1947. His sisters were not invited to the wedding. Of his immediate family, only his mother Alice was there. The woman who had been locked in an asylum when he was 10, who had sheltered Jewish refugees from the Gestapo, who would end her days living quietly in a room at Buckingham Palace that Elizabeth gave her, who died in 1969, and whose last letter to her son read, "Be brave, and remember I will never leave you, and you will always find me when you need me most." Philip gave up his naval career when Elizabeth became Queen in 1952. He had been on track, those who knew him said, to become First Sea Lord, the highest rank in the Navy. He walked away from it. He took the 2 steps back, and he stayed there for 70 years, and he almost never complained about any of it. There is a particular kind of strength that comes not from privilege, but from its absence from learning very early that no one is coming to save you, that the world does not owe you stability or comfort or a place to belong, and that the only way through is to build something from whatever is in your hands. Philip built himself from almost nothing. A fruit box on a naval ship, borrowed houses and other people's dining tables, a mother he couldn't reach, and a father who didn't try. Sisters on the wrong side of history, a country that wasn't his, a name that had to be changed, a family that had to be largely left behind. From all of that, he made a war hero, a husband, a father of 4, and a presence at the centre of British public life for 3/4 of a century. He was irascible sometimes, impatient often, occasionally impossible. He was also, by every account of those who served alongside him, genuinely brave, genuinely funny, genuinely kind to people who had no power and nothing to offer him. He visited veterans' hospitals and remembered faces. He built the Duke of Edinburgh's award into something that has now touched the lives of millions of young people in countries across the world. He cared, in ways he rarely bothered to explain, deeply. The Crown made him famous in a new way. The Netflix drama brought his story to audiences who had never thought about him much, and it captured something true. There was a man behind the ceremony, a complicated, fully formed human being who had sacrificed more than the world usually acknowledged. But the drama only scratched the surface. The real story, the fruit box, the asylum, the Nazi funeral, the searchlight at Cape Matapan, the letters to a princess across the years of war, that story deserves to be told in full. Because it is one of the most remarkable stories of the 20th century, and for most of it, he was just quietly getting on with it. He died on the 9th of April 2021, aged 99, at Windsor Castle. The Queen described his loss as leaving a huge void in her life. He was a prince born with everything and raised with nothing, who made himself into someone extraordinary and then spent 70 years making sure nobody really noticed. Now you know. Philip's story is one of those that tends to reshape how you see the familiar image. The man in the uniform, 2 steps behind, suddenly looks very different when you know where he started and what it took to get there. We hope this film has done that for you. If it has, please share it. History Roadshow exists to tell the stories that lie just beneath the history most people think they know. and every share and comment genuinely helps us reach more people. If you haven't subscribed yet, we would love to have you with us. There are more stories like this one coming. Thank you for watching.